Well, welcome everyone. My name is Carissa Inglis and I'm the Director of Services here at Queensland Foster and Kinship Care. You've joined into a webinar on standard of care, harm report procedures, and we're going to talk about reportable conduct as well. We thank you for joining us. We have lots and lots of interest in this webinar today. So we are just going to give it a few seconds for people just to continue to join, and then we'll get started. If you've got friends or colleagues or anyone that you were expecting to be in today, just make sure you send them a reminder and tell them to join in. I do want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're all meeting today, all in different parts of Queensland, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues that are joining us today, both within child safety, within foster and kinship care services, and of course our carers that are joining us. We know that this topic around harm reports and standards of care has an impact on our kin families in particular, and we need to make sure that we get these processes right so that we can maintain our kin placements and encourage and support kin to want to undertake care of their kin. I also, before I get started, I want to acknowledge the Chief Practitioner's Office for Child Safety, who've worked really closely with Queensland Foster and Kinship Care in this space. With the introduction of reportable conduct, there needed to be some changes to the harm report process, which we're going to go through in some detail today. And we're really happy with the way in which the Chief Practitioner's Office has worked with QFKC and, introduced some more steps in the process to ensure procedural fairness for carers. So just want to make that acknowledgement. Today's session is recorded, so we will be uploading this recording up onto our website following today's session, and it will be available for anyone to watch. Given that we are recording, you'll note that microphones and cameras have been disabled. The chat function is still open. However, just letting you know that we will provide an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of today's session. So we'll just get through all of the content and then have an opportunity to chat towards the end. I just ask that when you are putting in any questions in the chat function that you maintain confidentiality in respect to any identifying information, given it will be uploaded. If you have specific cases that you want to talk to QFKC about, that as carers you're affected by, or as foster and kinship care service staff that you would like to consult on, then please contact our main office on 3256 6166 and ask to speak to a case officer. So today's session, we're talking about standards of care and harm reports. Now, there's going to be two very distinct parts to this webinar, because what is really important is for people to understand the difference between a standard of care review and a harm report. Carers should experience those processes very differently, and the way they experience those differently is if the process feels different. So we're going to talk a lot about standards of care and the standard of care review process and how a carer should experience that. So if you're a carer online and you receive a standard of care review, what the process should look and feel like to you. And then we're going to move into the harm reports and the reportable conduct, which is very separate. So I want to be very clear about that. Okay, we are going to move through. So this is our content today. We're going to talk about how the department decides responses, what those pathway responses are, actions and outcomes, what the written requirements are, supports and advocates, and what the review process can look like. So that's our content. Firstly, we're going to look at deciding a response. So this is essentially what occurs when the department receives information. So they receive information, and that could be anyone. That could be from a member of the community, it could be from school, it could be from another service centre, it could be from anywhere. But they receive information and they have 2 days in which to gather contextual information. So when we think about what that contextual information could be, for example, if it's the school that have contacted the department with information, it could be that the department contacts the school back to get some more clarifying information. If the concerns relate to medical information, then it could be that relevant medical professionals are contacted. It can't be speaking to the child or speaking to the carer. So it's very clear in the practice manual that that is not about gathering contextual information. That has to be at the point where a decision is made. Otherwise, there are blurring of boundaries there in terms of when a process starts. In those 2 days, the department must consult with the Foster and Kinship Care Agency. And that was a procedure that was brought in 2013 and reflects the importance of the relationship that foster and kinship care agencies actually have with carer households, that they are funded to go in and provide day-to-day support to carers. And so the information that they hold in respect to carer families is critical in terms of informing what outcomes there should be. Now, there is some exceptions to that initially, and that is if the department receive information to indicate that a child is at immediate risk of harm, then obviously the department need to respond to that immediate risk straight away. They wouldn't necessarily be reaching out to consult with the agency. However, it doesn't mean that after the fact that they don't consult with the agency. So once the child safety has been established, then, you know, as part of the process, it would be important that the department consult with the agency. Consultation should also take place with CSOs from other children in the placement. When we talk about this, there's lots of service centres, particularly in the southeast region, where children are placed with carers from multiple different service centres or multiple different CSOs. And so it's really important that CSOs for all of the children in the placement are part of this process and are consulted. Now, the team leader makes a decision regarding whether a standard of care review is recorded, and a manager makes a decision around whether a harm report is recorded. The service centre where the carer is attached to is responsible for the decision making and will lead that response. So if the child is from Mount Cobat, but the carer is attached to Cannon Hill, then it will be Cannon Hill that drives that process and is the decision maker around that. It's really important to understand that at a consult meeting, if the manager is not present at that consult meeting, then a decision for a harm report cannot be made. A recommendation for a harm report can be made, but the decision has to be made by the service centre manager, and that's very clear. And we're going to talk, when we start talking about harm reports, around why that is the case. Harm report processes are formal processes that require formal responses, so it's really important that there is clear decision making and delegation in that space. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next slide. Now, the consult meeting is one of the most important meetings in these processes, because particularly when we're talking about standard of care matters, the consult meeting should be an opportunity for the care team to come together and talk about what the worries are. But in that consult meeting, it should not just be carer focused. The agency and the department sitting in that consult meeting should not just be focusing on what the carer has or has not done. The care team members should be also looking at what the care team members have or have not done that could have contributed to the worries. So, for example, if the concerns that have come through from the school are that the child has come to school and is saying that the carer is raising their voices at them, that the children's lunches aren't always like they should be or have been, that the children look a little bit dishevelled and are not concentrating in class and something's not quite right. If the department and or the agency were to go out to the carer and to raise concerns and place the blame squarely on the carer for those concerns, then that's not necessarily taking into account that the agency and or the service centre has said, well, we're going to, do an application for HSNA and that hasn't been done, or we were going to do an Evolve referral but that hasn't been done, or that we're going to put monthly respite in place for the carer because we understand that she needs a break, but that hasn't been done. So if we are going to sit in a consult meeting and talk about what the carer issues are, then we absolutely need to be looking at what those contributing factors are. So number one, is there a placement agreement? And if there is not a placement agreement, then we have particular service centres that will not raise a standard of care review without a placement agreement being in place, because the very thing that we do when standards are not met is we review a placement agreement. So if a placement agreement hasn't been done in the first instance, then that's where we should start. Now, if there is a placement agreement, then the role of the care team members in that consult meeting should be to look at, well, what did we say in the placement agreement? One, is it up to date? And two, does it cover all the things that it should be? And three, have we been doing it? And if we haven't been, then once again, that is about having a conversation and a discussion with the carer about, look, you know, we understand that there is pressure on the household and that has led to A, B and C, and we have contributed to that by not doing the things that we said that we would do in the original placement agreement. Now, the focus then becomes on the child and what we need to do to improve the situation rather than who is to blame. Standard of care reviews should not be about who is to blame. Standard of care reviews should be about identifying where standards are not being met for a child and getting things back on track for that child. So that is incredibly important. So in that consult, we'll just go back. So in that consult meeting, like I said, it shouldn't be carer focused, it should be care team focused, and what have the care team done or not done. Now, that very first point, in that consult meeting, you're looking at the placement agreement, whether it's been done, whether it hasn't been done, but you are also looking at section 1224 of the Child Protection Act. And so what that says is that the application of the standards to the child's care must take into account what is reasonable, having regard to the length of time the child is in the care of the carers, of the care or care service, and the child's age and development. That is often a missed piece of information that is not spoken about in the consult meetings, but it is absolutely critical, because what it essentially is asking the care team to do is apply context. So the example I use here is if you have two 10-year-old boys and the first 10-year-old boy lives with his nana and he's lived there since he was 2 years old, and he loves soccer. He loves soccer more than anything. And he has achieved relational and physical permanency because he's been with his nana for so long. He's gone to the same school, he goes to the same GP, he has the same friends, he goes to soccer, and he has his relationships there as well. So that's that child. Now, over here we have a 10-year-old that has just been removed from home, and they were not able to find a placement for the 10-year-old within his community. This 10-year-old also really loves soccer. And so one of the things that the department were looking at for a placement match was someone that was able to maintain his soccer practice and someone that was able to maintain getting the young person to his soccer on Saturdays. And they were able to find that. So it did mean that this 10-year-old had to move schools, but soccer to him was so incredibly important. His coach was a mentor to him. His friends provide that relational and physical permanency. It's a community that he thrives in and something that's really important to him. So those are your two scenarios, and he's with a foster carer that has just, accepted that placement and committed to having this child attend soccer, getting him to his practices twice a week and to his game on the Saturday. So we've got two 10-year-olds that both love soccer, but different circumstances in terms of their living arrangements. Now, if both of those carers were to say to the 10-year-olds, due to your behaviour, you're not playing soccer for 2 weeks, this 10-year-old over here won't be too happy about it, but he will be okay. He has his physical and relational permanency needs met. And he won't be affected emotionally too much by that decision. But this 10-year-old over here absolutely will be. His permanency in terms of his physical and relational permanency depends on him going to soccer, and it would be like taking family contact away from him. So when we put the same set of circumstances into two different placements, we potentially come up with two very different responses. And so whenever you are in a consult meeting, if you're an agency or a service centre that are in this particular meeting right now, those are the main things that you need to look at. So number one, is there a placement agreement? Number two, have we said that we would do what we need? Have we done what we said we would do? And number three, what does this look like in terms of section 1224? What is the context? How long has the child been in this placement for? And that is particularly the case for kin. When we are thinking about kin and our expectations of kin in terms of the statement of standards, what section 122 allows us to do is to apply context to the requirement for them to actually meet the standards. Okay, so that is our console. Right, we're going to go on to the next. Now, when we're talking about placement agreements, I just want to talk briefly around the importance of placement agreements. Now, placement agreements are not something that is driven procedurally or policy, it is driven by legislation. So when we talk about legislation, that is the must. It has to occur, it's not an option. And what we know is that placement agreements don't always occur. And we also know that without placement agreements, that can lead to situations where there is standards of care and even harm reports. So we just wanted to really highlight today that placement agreements are a requirement under the Act. The Child Protection Act outlines that a placement agreement is required, and in the Regulation of Care Act outlines what is required in that placement agreement. So we go on to the next slide. When we think about what the purpose of a placement agreement is, and probably before I go on to this, I just want to acknowledge that the current template for placement agreements is not great, and it has really become a compliance-driven tool rather than a purpose-driven tool. So I want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that our retention and development officers are currently working on a new template for placement agreements that we've consulted with carers about. And I think what's really important is that when we present this to the department, the template, that we really want a document that is seen as purpose-driven, not compliance-driven. And that is something that, you know, sees those see value in, that agency workers see value in, and that it really has the purpose of identifying placement needs and stabilising placements. So placement agreement purpose, it outlines the goal of the placement, it provides the relevant information about the child, and it records the agreed supports and services to be provided to the carer. So it's really a roadmap for the carer, and if we don't have that in, then consequences of not having placement agreements start to occur, and I think the next slide might talk about that. Yes, so we can have increased phone traffic to the service centre, because if there's no plan around who's doing family contact, transport, etc., then that's going to mean that carers are going to have to contact the service centre more frequently to work out what's happening. Carers may not adequately be informed about a young person's needs, and certainly QFKC completed a lived care experience survey for the Commission of Inquiry submission that we completed. We had 670 carers in the space of 3 weeks complete that survey. And, you know, when we asked questions about information that was provided to them relevant to the children that they had in their care, there was a huge percentage that identified that they weren't provided the relevant information at the time of the placement, nor, you know, during the placement. And sadly, 2/3 of the carers that responded to the survey indicated that at some point in time they'd had a placement breakdown. So we also see increased chance of standards not being met for children and young people. Educational, health and cultural needs are not being adequately met. There is a lack of shared understanding of all the matters relating to the placement, so we can start to make assumptions. So a carer will make an assumption that they have dual respite approved, and then when they do have respite and it's not paid at the dual rate, then, you know, that starts to create conflict. And once again, we had a good placement agreement in place, then that would not have been an issue. There's a lack of understanding regarding support needs, and so we often at QFKC get phone calls from carers saying, look, we're not feeling supported, but when we contact the agency and or the department, their view is that they are, and the reason and the issue lies in we just haven't defined what support actually looks like for this carer, because what good support looks like to one carer could be very different to what it looks like for another. And then we have instability and possible breakdowns of placements. Okay. So when we look at the pathway responses, the definition as set out in the practice manual says there is reasonable suspicion that the child care may not be meeting or not have met one of the standards of care as outlined in the Child Protection Act. And of course, it's not appropriate to select this response if it is suspected that the child may have also experienced harm, in which case a harm report will be recorded. Now, what you will note with that definition is it doesn't say anywhere there about it being attached to the carer. And the thing about a standard of care review is that when the process is finished, it's not attached to a carer. It is either the standards are met or they are not met, and now what do we need to do to get things back on track? That is very different to a harm report where there is a person recorded as responsible for the harm. So very distinct differences there, which should be driving that process. And I will continue to say it through this training and continue to re-emphasise that the responsibility to meet statement of standards for care for children does not lie with carers alone, and it can't. And the reason for that is because if we look at the statement of standards, if we look at the standards relating to meeting a child's therapeutic needs, meeting a child's health needs, meeting a child's dental needs, meeting a child's educational needs, meeting a child's disability needs, or meeting a child's family contact needs, cultural needs, all of those standards of care require a care team effort. A carer that does not have guardianship of a child cannot lead an NDIS plan. A carer cannot consent to therapy. A carer cannot consent to particular medical procedures that a child may need or have. And so when I sit here and talk about it as a care team responsibility, that's not my opinion, it is fact. It is the responsibility of the whole care team. And so when you're going into those discussion meetings, it should be not about who is to blame, but where potentially have we gone wrong and how do we get things back on track for the child? Okay, so that is very different to the next pathway response, which is a harm report. So the definition as set out in the practice manual says that a harm report is recorded when there is a reasonable suspicion a child in care has experienced harm, and that harm is caused by a carer, an adult household member or a staff member of a non-family based care arrangement. When we're talking about non-family based care arrangements, we're talking about residential facilities. Another adult or child over 10 with capacity to understand the consequences of their actions. And it is reasonably suspected that the actions or inactions of a carer, adult household member or staff member contributed to that experience of harm. I'll give you some examples there, but first we need to talk about this practice prompt because this is critical. Harm is in accordance with the Child Protection Act 1999, Section 9, which is a detrimental effect of a significant nature on a child's physical, psychological or emotional well-being. Harm can be caused by physical, psychological or emotional abuse or neglect or sexual abuse or exploitation. The thing about harm reports is it's not what I think is harmful. It's not what you think is harmful. It is what the Act identifies is harm. And you have to be able to identify what is the abuse and or neglect that we are alleging the carer has done in order to cause the harm to the child. So again, it's not that poor parenting, it's not that we have higher expectations. The definition of harm that we are using here is the same definition of harm that we use in respect to raising notifications in respect to birth parents in the community. So it is of a significant nature and you have to be able to identify the abuse and or the neglect that is causing the harm to the child. When we talk about harm, and we're going to talk more about this as we go on, but 10 years ago, harm reports were only internal processes, essentially, for child safety. So a harm report could result, in a substantiated outcome of harm, and that could result in a child being removed from the carer's home and a carer certificate being cancelled. So the consequences of the harm report were internal to the child protection system, and a carer could then go to QCAT and have the decision reviewed around the removal and around the cancellation. Today, the outcomes of harm are much more external and have an impact on blue cards and soon in respect to reportable conduct, which we are going to talk about when we go into our session around harm. The reason I raise that now is because we need to, the first step in making sure that processes are fair and just is ensuring that when we raise a harm report, that we are raising it in accordance with the definition of harm and in accordance with the Act. So that's our first step. So when we look at the harm report, another adult or child over the age of 10, sometimes that can create a little bit of confusion. So what's an example of what that might look like? So if we had a 9-year-old placed with a carer and the department placed a 12-year-old with the carer as well, and the 12-year-old offended against the 9-year-old. If the carer reported that immediately, had put all measures in place, that they weren't, the carer wasn't aware of any sexualised behaviours by the 12-year-old, they weren't sharing a room, there was appropriate supervision going on, the carer reported it immediately, then the actions of the carer has not contributed to the harm that has been experienced by the 9-year-old. So you can see a substantiated outcome of harm. The person responsible would be the 12-year-old if the department deemed that that 12-year-old was of capacity to understand the consequences of actions, but the standards would, there'd be no harm substantiated against the carer, and standards would be met because their actions or inactions haven't contributed to that. Whereas if you had a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old in a carer's home that had been there for a while, the 9-year-old had been saying to the carer for some time, I'm feeling really uncomfortable about the 12-year-old, he's coming into my room at night, I keep telling him to go away, he's not going away. The carer tells the 9-year-old not to worry about it. The 12-year-old then offends against the 9-year-old. The 9-year-old discloses to the carer, but the carer doesn't report that on, and continues to have the 12-year-old in the home, and he continues to offend against the 9-year-old. If that 9-year-old was then to disclose, that would be to the school, for example, that or the CSO, that would be an example of where there would be a harm report raised, obviously in respect to the 12-year-old still, but also in respect to the carer, and the harm that could be substantiated for the carer would potentially be neglect and or emotional, and standards not met because their actions or inactions contributed to the child being harmed by the 12-year-old. So hopefully that provides some clarity around that particular response. Okay. We're going to carry on. So the statement of standards, they provide a legislated set of standards around expected care provided to children and young people in alternate care, and these standards are in place to ensure that high level of care to children and young people who have experienced trauma so that they can experience an environment that assists them to heal and build resilience. It is the role of the whole care team to meet the statement of standards. So what does this even mean? Because sometimes when we look at the statement of standards, right, we say, food and shelter and physical care, and we think, of course, a carer is going to provide food and shelter. And unless we actually really unpack what that looks like in terms of day-to-day care and how trauma can impact a child's experience of that, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And particularly for our kinship carers that may be online today, it can be really confronting when, as a kinship carer, you're told, well, here are the standards that you have to meet every day. And then when the child goes to contact with mum and dad, they don't have to meet that level of care. It can feel really confronting about, well, why do I have that expectation? And I think probably the simplest way of, trying to help people understand it is to give some good examples about what it means for a child when we do that well. So if we were, for my own children, for example, if I was to raise my boys at a 16-year-old, that I had a secure relationship with, a strong attachment with, where that 16-year-old had experienced 16 years of positive care, where their they had experienced ruptures in relationships but repair, and that those ruptures and repairs were positive experiences that would take, an hour or two to kind of come around. So, 16-year-old is upset, mum yells at 16-year-old. That 16-year-old is not going to think that yelling is going to escalate to violence. It's not going to escalate to the 16-year-old being kicked out of home. It's not going to escalate to the 16-year-old being ignored for weeks on end. It's not going to result in any of that. That 16-year-old just knows that mum's cranky and that we will repair this really quickly. Whereas the 16-year-old that was new into the home, a new placement, when we think about what's happened for that 16-year-old in the past, if a foster carer or a kinship carer was to yell at them in those early moments of a placement, they don't know that that's not going to escalate to violence, because in the past when they've been yelled at, it has escalated to violence. Or they don't know that they're going to not be kicked out of home, because in the past that's what's happened. This could be their 30th placement. And, historically, when people get angry with them, they have to leave. And so the impact of raising a voice on someone that has not got those secure, healthy attachments can be significant. Another example could be that you are a foster carer and a child comes into your care and you dish up a roast pork for them, and you think, isn't it wonderful that they can have a roast pork with broccoli and cauliflower and potatoes and peas and all the stuff that's going to make them really healthy. If that child refuses to eat that, and your response as a foster carer is to say, well, actually, you're really lucky to have a roast and you should be grateful, and if you're not prepared to eat that, then you're going to have to go without. For that child who has never had that kind of food in front of them, that the textures and the colours and the smells just seem too overwhelming, that's going to be detrimental to them, because they will actually they just want the chicken nuggets and chips that they've had, or whatever the food that they've had their entire life. They don't want another change. And so it's those really simple things that we need to do. I remember many years ago when I was working for the department in another country, and I interviewed a 9-year-old child, and that 9-year-old child told me that things that made her feel happy was when she got to eat Wheat Bix for breakfast and when she got to go to bed at night in a cold bed. Now, when she came into care and went to stay with kin, the role of her kin was to show her that it's not a privilege to eat breakfast in the morning, and it's not a privilege to go to bed in a warm bed. It's actually a right. And so the importance of care is actually consistently meeting a standard of care where the child starts to predict that this is what's going to happen. I am going to be fed consistently. I am going to have a warm bed consistently. And that and if that doesn't happen, then I can speak up about it. That is so critically important. So that's why we have the standards of care. I do want to acknowledge that standards of care have been in the legislation since 1998, so they could do with a bit of an update to be more relevant to parenting in today's world, but that's what we have. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that QFKC and agencies and ACOs have been working on a statement of standard resource that helps carers to understand everything that I was just talking about, what the purpose of each of those standards are, what happens when we perhaps don't meet them, the care team's responsibility, all that really, really important stuff. So we hope for that standard of care resource to be released sometime in the very near future. So when we think about the standards of care, it is important that we put into context the fact that we are working with families, and our response to worries that are not harm-based should never be punitive or reactive. Rather, they should be seen as a community response that reflects the supportive and coordinated effort to a family in need. So what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is, if every single person on the line today thinks about their best friend or a family member or someone close to them that has children, and if you walk into their home tomorrow and it's a little bit chaotic, and the children are not like they usually are, and your friend is raising their voice, or things are just not quite right, then think about what your response would be. Because I know my response in those situations would be to help. I would walk into that home and I would help my friend, or I would help my family member. I would do the dishes, I would take the kids out, I would talk to my friend, I would see what was going on. But my thing would be that I wanted to help. And that is what, for the agency workers in the department on the line, that's what we're asking you to do. If you go into a home, into a carer's home, and you're not looking at harm, but you are looking at a carer household that may be struggling, then your response should not be punitive. Your response should be, how can I help? How can I improve this? Because when we help to meet the statement of standards, then we actually prevent situations that could escalate to harm further down. Obviously, if we were to walk into a home, into that same family, friends, or person's home, and you saw a child being harmed, your response would be different, and so it needs to be. But when we're not talking about harm-based behaviours, our responses need to be supportive and coordinated. Okay, so the review process, the standard of care review process, is that the senior team leader makes a decision and they plan the review. The discussion that takes place with the carer can either be led by the department and or the agency. So unlike a harm report process, which is the formal process and must be led by the department, a standard of care review process is seen as an informal process. And so that discussion can be led by the agency, it can be led by the department, or both. And remember, it's a discussion. It's about how have we all contributed to this, and like I said, how do we get things back on track? Discussion with the child, you should not be, for departmental workers on the line, you should not be using Section 17 of the Child Protection Act. And what that means is that children should not be taken out of class to be interviewed for a standard of care review, because we are not saying that harm is occurring, so we don't need to take that action. Exploring and taking a look at that broader context. So again, the whole care team's responsibility here. And again, consideration of that section 1224. So we're applying the standards of care. You know, the application of the standards of care must take into account that length of that placement and the child's age and development. We assess and consult again, and then we determine the outcome. Remember, the outcome is not attached to the carer, it is attached to the care team. So the commencement for a standard of care review has to occur within 5 days, and that's very different. Again, we are going to talk about harm later, but I do want to make some comparisons here, because for harm it's 24 hours. The child has to be cited within 24 hours, whereas a standard of care review is within 5 days, and that is either commenced at the point of having a discussion with the carer or the child. Now, completion within 4 weeks. And, you know, there may be some on the line that are thinking, oh, that's not achievable, but I can tell you it is. Because if we change the way that we look at standards of care, and it's not a punitive, blame-driven process, but it is about getting things back on track for a child, then when you approach the carer's home and you're having that discussion as a care team about where have we, you know, gone wrong, then within 5 to 10 minutes of that discussion, you can identify whether the standards have been met or not, because the focus is not about who's to blame, but it's about the child and whether the standards were met or not. And if everyone takes their responsibility for the part, then it can be very easily reached that the standards haven't been met. And then you can just get on with doing the placement agreement review. And you can leave that discussion with the carer with the process finished, because you've done the placement agreement review. You've got things on track now for the child, and it's all completed within the time frame. So it's really just changing the way that we look at it. I think what's important here to identify is back in 2020, the department did some reviews of standard of care reviews, and for the 60 standard of care reviews that they looked at, of the ones where standards were not met, 70% went on not to do a review of the placement agreement, which is really concerning, because that is the purpose. If standards are not met, then what are we going to do about it? So one of the other things that the review identified is that, and this is for standard of care processes, but for also for harm, is that we get so focused on the process of investigation or assessment that the original worries or concerns that have been raised takes a back seat and we're not actually responding to it. So, for example, if we've got a carer, if the concerns are that the carer is not coping and, you know, that it's having an impact on the children because of the stress in the household, we're not actually responding right. Do we put respite in immediately, or what do we do right here and now? We're waiting until the assessment is completed before we put things in place. And I think certainly from the chief practitioner's view, we should be responding in the moment to what the concerns or issues are, not waiting for the outcome to do that. If there's immediate things that can be done to support that placement, then we should be doing those immediate things. Okay, so our key concepts for SOC reviews are: it is a shared responsibility. It is not on a carer to meet the statement of standards in isolation to the care team. And I want that to be a really clear message that everyone today takes away. No person is recorded as responsible. It's either standards are met or not met. We need to take a look at all of the contributing factors. The child remains the central focus and their voice is heard. Terminology is not punitive. You should not be hearing the word breach, because that word breach was taken out of the practice manual in 2013. It has not been in the practice manual for 13 years, and yet we still hear it. When you think about why that word was taken out of the process for a standard of care review, it's because the word breach is actually affiliated with criminal behaviour and really negative connotations. So that is why we either say standards are met or not met. We should not be using that word breach. And the outcomes is focused on the whole care team, not on an individual. Okay, so like I said, met or not met. If they're not met, then you review the placement agreement and looking at what the whole care team needs to do to address the issues. Now, let's say there are situations, because I can, you know, I've been around long enough to know that there are times where maybe the agency and the department have done everything that they said that they would do, but standards are still not, you know, being met by a carer household. So then it's a matter of, it's not, can I be very clear, it's not a matter of, okay, now there's been 3 standards of care, we're going to raise a harm report. It has to meet the threshold for harm. So if you're going to raise a harm report and you're talking about cumulative harm, then again, but you still have to identify the abuse and or neglect that is causing the harm. So it can't just be 3 strikes, you're out. But if there are continuous concerns about a carer not meeting the statement of standards, then and everything has been put into place, then there needs to be some discussion either about a suitability review, sitting down with the carer with the statement of commitment and going through roles and responsibilities so that everyone's really clear about expectations, and ensuring that, you know, things such as the foster care agreement is matching the types of placements that are that they should or are suitable to take. So the foster care agreement can be reviewed at any time. It's a good trigger point when there's either a standard of care review, standards not met, or a harm report substantiation to actually look at the foster care agreement and make sure that we've got the matches right, that we're not asking carers to do what's outside of their capacity, for example. Okay. So that's the process around a standard of care review. I hope that that's been really helpful, and I hope that the messaging that has been taken away from that is around that real focus on that being a care team responsibility, and the importance of every single care team member knowing what their roles and their responsibilities are. And that when we are doing a standard of care review, that our focus absolutely needs to be on getting things back on track for a child, not on who is to blame. Okay, so harm reports and reportable conduct. I said to you earlier in this webinar that the processes around harm reports are very different to what they were 10 years ago. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is an evolving space. So I'm going to talk to you about reportable conduct today. And again, I want to thank and acknowledge the Chief Practitioner's Office for working so closely with QFKC in this space to help us understand it, but to also implement additional procedures that have resulted in increased procedural fairness in that harm report space. Now, the thing is that reportable conduct comes into play on the 1st of July, and it will be an evolving space. So what I talk about today is certainly what the plan is, and this training has been viewed by the Chief Practitioner's Office, but things could change down the track when the reportable conduct scheme is actually introduced. And through practice, it may be, well, no, that's not working. We may need to change it to this, or we may need to change it to this. So this is about the harm report stuff that I talk about today is actually in procedures. The reportable conduct is how the Chief Practitioner's Office are proposing it's going to look. But like I said, that's an evolving space and could change. So it will come into effect on the 1st of July. The Queensland Family and Child Commission will be responsible for the oversight of the scheme. Just quickly, where has this come from? It's come from the Royal Commission into Institutionalised Abuse. That was a federal inquiry. And one of the recommendations that were that reportable conduct schemes be introduced in each state and territory. So we are not the first to introduce, but we are not the last. So Victoria and New South Wales are two that we know are in place and have been operating for a while, which is good for Queensland because it means that we can kind of look to other states and territories to see what's working and what's not. If I give you an example about why a reportable conduct scheme is really important, it might help us to understand why it's in place. So if we think about the current convicted childcare worker that's in prison that was charged with over 300 offences. So he essentially went from one daycare to the next, to the next, to the next, committing offences, and there was no oversight mechanism in place or no set way of those daycares needing to respond or report on. And so that's how he managed to get away with what he did for so long. And that's just not acceptable. It's absolutely unacceptable that in today's day and age that we can have someone in the system that is capable of getting away with that level of harm in such a broad sense. So the idea of the reportable conduct is that those child safe organisations who will have reportable conduct schemes, such as childcare centres, will have to report, those allegations up to the Queensland Child and Family Commission, and they will have to investigate them. And the Child and Family Commission will oversight the way in which they're being investigated and handled to ensure that children are safe. And then there's reporting mechanisms back to blue cards, which can result in loss of blue cards, which means that those types of people are just not going to be able to operate in those environments. So that's a positive thing. Can we just go with that? So the other thing is on the 1st of October of last year, child safe standards was introduced into legislation. So child safe standards are a set of 10 standards that were introduced as part of the whole child safe organisation bill. So you've got your child safe standards and your reportable conduct, right? And there is around about 40,000 child safe organisations out there. So essentially any child regulated employment, any organisation that's working with children has to implement the child safe standards. One of those, for example, is the Child Safe Standard 7, which talks about the importance of organisations ensuring that staff and volunteers have the skills and the training needed to undertake the job that we're asking them to do. And the idea is that if we implement child safe standards, if they're implemented within all these child safe organisations, then we prevent reportable conduct from occurring. So a really good example of that is at the moment, it's not a requirement for kinship carers to do any training. And so if you're a grandmother on the line You can come in and you can be a carer, and I'm not required to provide any training to you, but I'm also asking you to provide care to your grandson who has suffered trauma. And is going to have behaviours associated with that. And I expect you to respond appropriately to those behaviours, but I actually haven't told you how to do that. And so under the new child safe standards, if we had a situation where, like I said, grandma was given child to care for, we haven't provided with her any supportive training on how to manage those behaviours, and then she responds in a way that's harmful to the child, and then we go down a process where the blame again is on the carer. What the Child Safe Standards will do, and what reportable conduct overseen by the Queensland Child and Family Commission will do, is were the Child Safe Standards met to prevent reportable conduct? And so if we're starting to see patterns within service centres, for example, where, you know, we've got 10 kin that have had harm reports, and actually when we look at the Child Safe Standards, none of those kin were provided with training to support them to understand, you know, what the requirements were in terms of responding to trauma-based behaviours, then there'll be some learnings for child safety to undertake there. So the idea is that we have child safe standards, we implement them day to day, and QFCC has oversight of that. And when we do that, and we do that well as child safe organisations, then we prevent reportable conduct. It's kind of like when we think about the statement of standards, isn't it? Because if we all work as a care team to meet statement of standards for children, then we will help to prevent instances of harm reports. So reporting entities require the organisation to care for, supervise or have authority over children and be mentioned in Schedule 2 of the Child Safe Organisation Act in order to have a reportable conduct scheme. Child Safety have set up a reportable conduct unit who will be responsible for managing reportable conduct incidences, inclusive of reporting up to QFCC. So you will have your harm report processes occurring, and concurrently to that, you will have reportable conduct investigations occurring. And there's going to be a slide on that. So some of this is going to feel really confusing, but like I said, this is being recorded and there's slides. So hopefully as we work through the slides, you'll start to understand it. Harm report matters and reportable conduct matters are two separate processes, but they will run concurrently. We do have a link there, which we'll put in underneath our PowerPoint, which has all the information from the QFCC around child safe standards and reportable conduct schemes. So it's kind of a user guide, and it might be helpful for staff, carers to go and have a look at. Okay, so the definitions. So we're doing some comparison here, which helps people hopefully to understand the difference. So I've already gone through the definition of harm. And there, right next to it, you'll see the definition of reportable conduct. So it includes a child sexual offence, sexual misconduct committed in relation to or in the presence of a child, ill treatment of a child, significant neglect of a child, physical violence, and behaviour that causes significant emotional or psychological harm. So we're just going to go on to the next slide now, which breaks that down a little bit more. I know that that's really little, but you'll find that table actually in that link that we provided before. So it just goes into a little bit more detail about what QFCC mean when they say a child sexual offence or when they talk about ill treatment of a child. So it just gives a bit more information about that. Okay, we'll carry on. So what are some other key points? For the carers on today, it's not just about you. Reportable conduct is about anyone and everyone that works in a child safe organisation that has a reportable conduct scheme. So it is inclusive of CSOs, it is inclusive of agency workers, it is inclusive of carers, it's inclusive of childcare workers, it's inclusive of your PCYC, your before and after school care workers, your teachers. So this is not a scheme that is targeting carers at all. This is a team that is targeting everyone that has a role in providing care or supervision to children. It may be one act or a series of acts or incidences, and it does not need to have occurred in the course of the worker's employment. So what that means is, essentially, if you work for an organisation where you are subject to reportable conduct, then the expectation is that your conduct in any setting is conduct that is positive. So, for example, if CSOs online, if you went down to the rugby grounds on Saturday and you treated a child very wrongly or hurt a child, then you could be subject to reportable conduct for that. It doesn't need to be in your work capacity. So for the carers, again, that same scenario exists for you. So you could be a foster carer or a kinship carer, and then you could be at the netball grounds with your own child. And if you engage in a reportable conduct offence, then that could impact on your volunteer or your employment position. And it relates to any worker or volunteer who performs work of any kind for the organisation. So it includes employees in all capacities, contractors, subcontractors, consultants, labour hire workers, trainees, work experience employers, and religious leaders. Carers, it doesn't change your requirements under the Child Protection Act 13F around your need to be you're a mandated reporter. So if you see a child being harmed, if you see a person engaging in reportable conduct, then you have obligations to report back to the department. Okay, so here is the concurrent process that will hopefully help us to understand the harm report and reportable conduct process more clearly. Like I said, the reportable conduct process, that's subject to change, but this is what we think it's going to look like right now. But the harm report is in place. So essentially, for a harm report, you have your consult meeting. Okay, so that's what we talked about earlier. And again, there should be focus on who else has contributed to this. But when we're talking about harm, it is about a person responsible. So the service centre and the agency are currently present there for your consult meetings. As of the 1st of July, there will be someone present from the reportable conduct unit there as well, because they will have all the information to determine also whether there are also allegations of reportable conduct that has occurred. Now, I want to provide some examples here about a little bit of difference, because the department, when they are investigating and or assessing is the correct terminology, when the department are assessing a harm report, they're looking at all of the information and whether all of that information has contributed to a harm being experienced by a child. So they don't need to come up for an outcome for each of those allegations. They need to identify whether, based on the balance of probability, these things have occurred and whether that has contributed to harm to a child. So, for example, the allegations could be that the carer dragged the child across the ground, hit the child across the face, made the child go into their room for an hour, made the child miss out on dessert for a whole week, and all the other children were allowed them. So all of those things together, the department will put all the concerns together, and their assessment is overall whether the child has experienced harm. So the focus for the department and their assessment is on the child's experience and whether harm has occurred based on abuse. With reportable conduct, their focus is on the behaviour of the carer. So that is the focus that they're looking at. So with those allegations that I just spoke about, it may be that the department's leader outlines all of those concerns. So the allegations are emotional and physical harm, and these are the concerns: that you dragged the child across the house, that you hit the child, that you made the child go into their room for a whole hour, that you have withheld dessert from the child for a whole week. And this has been the impact, and these are the standards that we're worried about, and this is what we're doing. Now, for the reportable conduct unit, it may only be that the dragging the child across the ground and hitting the child reach their threshold for reportable conduct incidences. So their letter will say there is alleged 2 allegations, and allegation 1 will be that you drag the child across the house, and allegation 2 that you hit the child. So those other 2 that were included in the harm report letter may not be recorded in the report of conduct. So you may not have 2 letters that look the same because the focus is different, if that makes sense. So we've got the decision letter. So the carer at this point will receive 2 letters, one from the Department in respect to harm and one from the reportable conduct unit if it is established in that consult meeting that there is incidences of reportable conduct as well. So 2 letters so far. When that consult is happening, there'll be some planning as to, okay, so what are our next steps here? What do we need to do? Now, the reportable conduct unit will be very clear with the service centre staff about what they need their staff, the service centre staff to do in order to satisfy the reportable conduct investigation. So they won't do their own investigation. They will rely on the service centre to go out and do the interviews with the carer. The carer may be offered a Teams interview with the reportable conduct unit that is looking like it might be an option, but the carer can just rely on the interview with the service centre to take place. And so the reportable conduct unit will be saying to the service centre staff, we need you to ask this question, this question and this question to satisfy our investigation as well. Now, after the assessment takes place, this is one of the new steps that we're really excited about, and again, one of the things that we worked with the Chief Practitioner's Office. Often in harm reports, what would occur is that a carer would have their interview and then they wouldn't hear anything, and then they would just get an outcome letter. And when they received their outcome letter, they would say, well, you've missed this, this and this, but it was too late, there was an outcome letter. And so then they'd have to go through a process of review, and it would be like a really difficult time in terms of, because the department mostly do a desktop review, and so then we would have information that was mixed. So the step that has been put in here is a proposal for an adverse finding. So the department do their investigation and their assessment, and they are thinking we are going to substantiate this. They now must provide a letter to the carer saying we are proposing to substantiate the type of harm and any of the standards and why. And then the letter says, we want to hear your side of the story. You can do this by emailing, phoning, meeting. But essentially it's giving a carer an opportunity to say, this is what we're thinking and this is why. Have you got anything else to add? And that could be the time where the carer says, well, yes, I do. You need to contact the doctor because you haven't done that. Or you need to contact my neighbour because you haven't done that. Or you haven't actually interviewed everyone in the house. Or you haven't done A, B and C. So that is a really key important step. And a carer has 14 days in which to respond. Now, at the same time, if there is an incident of reportable conduct and they also are identifying that it's going to be a proposed adverse finding, you'll get a separate letter from them. And their letter will say, this is what we are proposing and this is the reason why. And those are 2 different responses. Now, in the harm report letter, it has QFKC's details in it now. So please, if you are a carer and you receive a harm report and it feels also overwhelming, then please, by all means, contact us and we can support you through that process. The practice panel then takes place. So once the service centre has all the information back from the carer, they will then, and this is another step that has been introduced into the process around procedural fairness, they will hold a practice panel, and there is practice panel guidelines within the department's practice manual that talks about who could sit on those. The agency should be there. If the child identifies as Aboriginal or the carer identifies as Aboriginal, then there should be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives on the panel. And there is the ability to have a critical friend on the panel as well, because these processes need to be fair and just. And it's important to bring other people to the table so that we're mindful of our confirmation and unconscious bias, and that everyone is able to really unpack. Now, as of the 1st of July, the reportable conduct unit will also be part of that practice panel. We're going to talk more about the practice panel as we go on. And then, like I said, the outcome leader. So the outcome, like I said, for a harm report is focused on the harm to the child, and that comes from your service centre manager. The outcome for reportable conduct will be focused on the behaviour of the carer, and that will come from the reportable conduct manager. Okay, so hopefully that provides a bit of a idea as we go into a bit more detail here. So once again, reiterating, the manager has to make a decision for a harm report. The child has to be cited within 24 hours. That consult still should take place with the agency. The department must drive those interviews, so it can't be the agency or the department, it has to be the department, and they will conduct that interview with the carers. Child safety still has responsibility to assess that broader context, but the department used to have 6 weeks and now have 8 weeks to take into account the proposed adverse finding, which provides 2 weeks for the carers to respond. Now, as of the 1st of July, at the moment, the department can't raise a harm report on risk of harm alone, but as of the 1st of July, when reportable conduct comes in, it will be an option. So that's, for example, such as at the moment, if you have a 15-year-old girl that is not in the placement but makes an allegation against the carer family, at the moment, only a harm report can be raised about that 15-year-old as the subject child. If there are children currently in the placement, they can't be named as subject children unless they make a disclosure. But this new process will mean that the department can raise a harm report in relation to the 15-year-old, but risk of harm in respect to children that are in the placement if it's reasonably suspected that the children will be at unacceptable risk of harm. Okay, so what to expect when going through a harm report? Now, the first thing I want to say here is there's probably lots of carers on the line that are thinking, oh my goodness, I'm feeling really nervous, about harm reports. I just want to say that I haven't got most recent up-to-date data because Unify isn't capturing that at the moment and it's not online. But in 2024, there was over 6,000, there was about 6,100 carer households. And for that year, there was around 570 harm reports that were recorded. So less than 1% of carers that year received a harm report. And then of those, only 240 were substantiated. So I just want to put some context around it because these are not processes that are going to happen on a regular basis by any stretch of the imagination. They are, processes that only occur in a very small percentage of our carer households. But what is really important is that you understand if you are in a situation where you do have a harm report, what your rights are and how to respond. Okay, so we've already talked about when a harm report is recorded. You may not receive a letter immediately advising you what the concerns are, particularly if Queensland Police are involved because they will be driving that process, but you are required to be provided with a letter at the time of the harm report interview, which will outline what the alleged harm is and what standards may not be being met. The process will be formal and involve interviews. Carers should be provided with advice that they can record the interview on your own device and your obligations around confidentiality. If you are a carer and you receive a harm report, I would encourage every time to record it so that there is a clear one version of what occurred, and if that may be required in potential legal proceedings regarding blue cards or QCAT matters down the road. So you have the right to record and please do. A carer, you're able to have a lawyer present, and the practice manual says very clearly to CSOs and to department staff to make allowances for legal representative to be there. And that's, again, we never used to have that in the practice manual. That is something new and is very illustrative of, what those processes and the consequences of those processes can have. What I will say to you though, if you're a carer and you do bring a lawyer into that process and your lawyer tells you not to speak, that is not good advice because the department will still complete their harm report process, regardless of whether you have input into that or not. So it's in your interest to respond and provide a response to the department so that they can take that into account in their assessment. You should expect procedural fairness. You should expect privacy and confidentiality to be maintained. You should be offered support, and you should be told about how you can make a complaint if you're dissatisfied. So like I said, criminal matters, there are certain allegations that meet a particular threshold as outlined in the Department's Child Protection Act, where the Department must advise Queensland Police, and Queensland Police can ask for a harm report process and a reportable conduct investigation to be put on hold until their processes are finalised or when they're ready for the department to proceed. Now, if the police say we're not progressing, that does not mean that there's not going to be an adverse finding with the reportable conduct unit or the department, because the criminal matters have to reach a threshold of beyond all reasonable doubt, whereas it's on balance of probability for both reportable conduct and for harm report matters. Okay, so these are just some key messages that are in the practice manual around the importance of communicating to carers where there is a criminal matter. If you're a carer present and you do get a harm report and it is referred to police, don't hesitate to call Queensland Police yourself, because they will talk to you. They won't talk to your agency, they won't talk to QFKC, but they will talk to you. Yeah. So those principles for procedural fairness, the way in which harm reports operated prior to the introduction of reportable conduct coming into place did not align with what expectations around procedural fairness should look like. So there has been those two steps that have been introduced, which is that proposal to substantiate that we've spoken about, and the practice panel. So we'll just show you where you can find those. So that, what you see there, is exactly what's in the practice manual. So if you go into the department's practice manual, anyone can access it. That's what it says in respect to giving notice for an adverse finding. Now, that came into effect on the 2nd of February. So if you're a carer that is joining online, or if you're an agency worker or a department worker that are currently going through a harm report process, you can't have an outcome now without actually providing the carer the opportunity to respond. And that's outlined in the practice manual. Yep. And that harm report assessment panel. So with the introduction of the self-disclosure laws, which, like I said, with blue cards on the 20th of September of last year, with legislative changes, it's now a requirement for a carer to advise blue cards if there is a substantiated if there's a substantiated harm report, with them as the person responsible for the harm. So if there's a substantiated harm and someone else is identified as the responsible person, then you don't need to report. You have to be the person responsible for the harm in order to report. And so the idea of the practice panel is providing a really robust system where we have got the letter back from the carer, or the information back from the carer from the proposal to substantiate, and that we're coming together and really discussing what the information is that we have. And if we are going to substantiate, so if the decision from the service centre manager is to substantiate, then are the children going to stay there, and what is the action plan, and how do we satisfy, because all of that has to be reported back up to the Queensland Child and Family Commission. Yes, we are substantiating, but we're leaving the children there, and this is the action plan and how we are going to continue to meet the child's needs and ensure that they're safe. So the idea of the practice panel is not just to kind of come up with an outcome, like that delegation for that outcome still sits with the service centre manager. The practice panel members can only recommend, but it's also about, and then what? Are we doing an action plan? Are we doing a suitability review? Are we doing a cancellation? Like, what is our next steps, and how do we collectively identify how we're going to keep these children safe, mitigate risk, and report back to QFCC? Yeah. So these are the outcomes. So an action plan is required when it's substantiated harm standards not met, and that's the only time where you would do a self-disclosure. All the other outcomes, so the unsubstantiated harm standards not met now requires a placement agreement review. It used to require an action plan before the 1st of October last year, but it's now a placement agreement review. So the only time we would do an action plan now is if it's substantiated harm standards not met. If the department decide not to engage in an action plan, there's 3 options. You either engage in an action plan, you cancel the carer certificate or propose to cancel the carer certificate, or you undertake a suitability review. So one of those 3 things needs to occur. But like I said, a substantiated outcome has to be reported to Blue Cards. That could result in Blue Cards suspending a carer's Blue Card, which then would mean that the department does have to remove and does have to suspend the carer certificate of approval, because a carer is not able to function as a carer without an approved Blue Card. I want to let people know that these legislative changes have had immediate and significant impacts on carers in respect to substantiated harm, and QFKC will be meeting with Blue Card Services alongside the Chief Practitioner's Office in the next week to look at that and the impacts, and just getting some much more clearer messaging out to carers. So we're on to that. Okay, action plans, again, 8 weeks to complete. The importance of, if you are a service centre or a carer listening in an agency, all of you actually, if the outcome is substantiated, then really you need to have that action plan done as quick as, because when the carer reports that substantiated outcome to Blue Cards, they should be able to accompany that with the action plan to say, yes, it's substantiated, but this is what we've all agreed upon we're going to do. So I think that's really important. Yep. Again, the purpose of the action plan is to address the risk to the child safety and wellbeing that resulted in the harm or the risk of harm. The actions identified within the action plan must directly correlate with the issues identified in the harm report assessment, and that's what Blue Cards and that's what QCC will be looking for. Yeah. If additional concerns are raised in the course of a harm report or a standard of care review, you don't raise another harm report or another standard of care review. You actually begin that process. So you look at those concerns in the process you're already in. So you're in the middle of a harm report and the child makes further disclosures. You don't raise another harm report. You actually go back to the carer and interview them in respect to that, and let the reportable conduct unit know in case any of those matters relate to reportable conduct. What's really important also is that a standard of care can be upgraded to a harm report, but a harm report cannot be downgraded to a standard of care. So if you're in that consult meeting at the very beginning and you're just not quite sure, does this meet the threshold for harm, always record a standard of care review, because you can actually upgrade it to a harm report throughout that process if needed, but you can't downgrade it once it's already a harm report. Yeah. Outcome advice. So with standard of care matters, it's actually not a requirement and procedures for carers to receive outcome letters, and that was an outcome of 2013 procedural changes. And the idea of not having outcome letters for standard of care was so that we had processes that weren't formal. The moment we start putting letters together, we formalise it. But what's occurred is that practice has not reflected that, and agencies and carers sometimes request letters, and so then they'll come up with these templates. And the templates are not helping in the process of ensuring that it's a care team responsibility, because those letters, those standard of care outcome letters that I've seen often use the word breach. It's always carer focused, and essentially because there was never a template developed for a standard of care review outcome letter, we've just taken what was developed for a harm report and changed it a bit. QFKC will be working with the Chief Practitioner's Office, hopefully, to develop a bit of a template for standard of care review outcome letters that will be more reflective of it being a care team approach. But at the moment, they're not a requirement. They are being done. We know that there are some issues in that space. And birth parents aren't required to be advised of a standard of care review. When we come to a harm report, yes, there are outcomes, there are letters required. So now there's 3 letters. Remember, the initial letter that is issued, and then the letter around the proposal to substantiate, if there is a proposal to substantiate, and then an outcome letter. And then, of course, those 3 letters from reportable conduct as well that may occur. There is a requirement to tell birth parents. However, there is, the practice manual says at least one birth parent has to be advised of the recording of a harm report and the outcome, but there is the ability for a senior team leader to make a decision not to, and rationale has to be recorded. So you'd need to look at the rationale and the reasons why. Okay, a review process. If carers are not happy with the outcome of either a standard of care review or a harm report, they can request a review. Currently, the only available option for carers is an internal review through the complaints process. Either a senior prac from the office they are attached to or an independent person will conduct the review. You should be able to identify what it was about the process that was not fair and just. So were there interviews that were missed? Was there information that was not taken into account? Hopefully we see a reduction in that now that we've got the proposal to substantiate and the ability for carers to kind of get in before a final outcome is provided. We want to be really clear that QFKC believes that there needs to be an external avenue of review. We believe that a harm report outcome should be a reviewable decision in QCAT because of the consequences that they come with, and that's certainly a recommendation that we've put in our submissions to the inquiry. And you know, we hope that that gets some traction. Okay. So messaging, it takes a whole care team to meet the statement of standards for children and young people. You know, I really, like there's 146 people online, and I can tell you that every single one of you would have entered into the profession or the carer role because you have good intent and you want to make positive changes in children's lives. The child protection system can make that really hard at times. It's a really tough system to work on. It's a really tough system to parent in. And, you know, we need to show grace to one another, and you know, in those matters where we're not talking about harm, we really need to support each other, because at the moment Queensland has 40% of the total amount of children and young people in Australia in residentials just in Queensland, 40%. And if we're serious about decreasing the number of children in residential facilities, then we need to be serious about supporting family-based placements and care, and that means everyone taking shared responsibilities. We need to understand that carers are everyday families with the same stress factors that we all face day to day, and on top of that, they have added stress in having to parent in a statutory system. And our job should be to surround carer families with support to help them be the best that they can be. So those are our contact details. I know that that is a whole lot of information. Like I said, this will be recorded and it will be uploaded onto our website with the PowerPoint so that you can access that. We do have some time for questions now. So I've got Josie, our Program and Project Officer, that is on the computer. And so if anyone has any specific questions right now, you can put those. Like I said, just maintain confidentiality in terms of not identifying any children or young people in care or identifying information. And if you've got actual cases that you would like assistance with, you can contact our office. We're just waiting, just give you a couple of minutes to see whether there is any questions. Probably while I'm waiting, I want to also acknowledge the regions have been really requesting that QFKC come out and do this particular training to service centres. Over the last few months, QFKC have been out to every service centre in the southeast region and facilitated the training, and we've just had a request from the southwest region as well. So it's really positive to see that the service centres in the regions are wanting, you know, their staff to hear this training. Okay, so what's the obligations of the CSO to investigate injuries reported that occurred during family contact? So that's probably, that's in relation to a birth parent, and so that's not, that doesn't sit in the standard of care or harm report space. But if you feel that you've reported concerns in relation to what's occurred to a child during family contact and that hasn't been responded to, then you would need to contact and go through the complaints process. So first you would go to the CSO team leader or manager, and then if you didn't get a response there, then you could go to the complaints, the department's regional complaints. Any other questions around the standard of care or harm report process? My brain is exploding. Neville, I can understand that. It's a lot of information. I've been working in this space for a very long time, so it makes perfect sense to me, but I can appreciate that people on the line that are hearing the stuff about reportable conduct in particular for the first time, it can feel really overwhelming. Any other questions? Okay, I think everyone's brains are either exploding or I've answered everything that I possibly can, so one of the two. I do want to thank, this is probably out of all of the webinars that we've done, one of the most attended over the years. So I just want to thank everyone for joining in. Can I have a SOC review to understand? So that would be an individual case matter. So the carer that's just written that, please contact our office on 325 66166, and we can certainly have a case officer talk that through with you. Okay. All right. Well, once again, thank you everyone for joining in, and we'll have this up on the website in the next couple of days, and we thank you for your time. Thanks, everyone.